just to introduce myself very quickly, my name's Matthew Ward. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Dundee here in Scotland in history. I'm in the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Law. I have quite a long history. As you can tell, I'm sort of getting a little long in the tooth here. I have quite a long history of working in sort of technology and areas. Years ago, I was a network supervisor in the 1990s and things, and that is significant in terms of some of the things I'll be talking about later. But I want to talk about how I was using TALIS Elevate in a trial, and that is significant as well, for a level 4 history module that I was teaching last year here, or I suppose this year, but in the autumn at the University of Dundee. So can we go on to the first slide? So just to say, first of all, I want to just sort of stress that this was a trial that I was doing. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about my students' experience of this that I think is significant, and also things that I would do. Hopefully I'm going to be using this again in a different module that I'm teaching next year. But had I had more time to think about how I was going to use it, had I known that we were definitely going to have Elevate a little bit earlier before I was preparing the module, I might have done things a little bit differently. So this was just a trial, and I think this is important to stress. Can we go on to the next slide then? So what I want to say about how I used Elevate was this was a large level 4 class. So in Scotland, the degree program is for 4 years. So this is a final year history module called Settling the Trans-Appalachian West. I rather like pre-recorded lectures and things. So what I did in this module was I decided to use pre-recorded presentations at the start to introduce materials, rather than the way I would have done before, where we would have started the class with a sort of general presentation and then go on to discussions, and use that time to get the students to think about sources. And in this case, I got the students to use Elevate to sort of think about how they were using the sources. So we'd start off with a general discussion of what the students had been reading, of issues that they thought were important for each week. Then the students in the class would break into 4 groups. Each group would examine a different source, and they would just use Elevate as a way of sort of recording their observations. There was no assessment of this specifically, but students did use the source materials in their presentations for the modules, in a blog they did on the module, and most importantly, in an extended source-based essay, a 4,000-word essay that they wrote at the end of the module. I should say that I was sort of surprised that every student had a laptop. So access in this sense was no issue, but occasionally when students didn't bring a laptop into class, they had no problems accessing the material on their phone. And now I just want to show you some of the things that the students were doing. So can we go to the next slide? So I distributed the materials through our virtual learning environment. We use Blackboard, and I simply put links in each week. There is a formal, I think, link to use for Elevate. I didn't use that because I only got access to it at the last minute, but this worked perfectly. And I was able to set it up so I had 2 seminar groups. Each group accessed the materials differently. I'll say a little bit about that as well later on. Can I have the next slide? So this is what the students were doing. Most of the materials they accessed from me were things that I transcribed from my own research. And I think that's quite significant. So different students were going through, highlighting different parts of the materials that they were reading. I didn't give them much guidance beforehand, and if I was doing this again, I really would. I'd outline to them much more clearly what I'd like them to do and how they could use this. Can we have the next slide? And it's just another example of the sorts of things that students were doing. Yeah, and I'll talk about how they found this quite useful. And then the next slide. What didn't work so well was where I asked the students to look at material that was original sort of source material. In this case, this is an 18th century newspaper. They found dealing with bigger PDFs, which could be sort of PDF documents or larger images, much more difficult. And I was quite disappointed with the way they interacted with these. I thought some of these newspapers, for instance, there's nice advertisements for enslaved people, which are right next to advertisements for horses. They look very much the same. There's all sorts of things they could have been thinking about, but they just didn't engage as well with these materials, which I was sort of surprised about, because when I've used these before in class with hard copies, they got quite excited about the newspapers, but this was the one thing that didn't seem to work quite as well as I would have liked. Can we go on to the next slide? What I found useful was I was able to monitor how the students had used these materials. And you can see from this that they were using them a lot early on in the module where we were having these source-based seminars. And then I think this is the significant thing, later on in the module, they were also looking at them again. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And the next slide. And it was also quite useful for me, and this is what I think I could use if I was using it for assessment. You can see very quickly which students have accessed material, how many comments they've made, how long they've spent engaging with the material. I found this incredibly useful, and I think if you were designing an assessment around this, this is something that you could use. Can we go on to the next slide? So my sort of conclusions, and in some ways at this point I'm damning with sort of faint praise. I thought it worked reasonably well. I hadn't thought about it as much as I could have done. I thought the students seemed much more focused on the sources. They were much more engaged in analysing the sources than when I just gave them a document to look at and asked them to talk about it in class. My plan had been to get them to use Padlet to put up their conclusions, but they just like putting them on Elevate. And so I thought that worked very well. It generated some good discussion. As I said before, my feeling was that it worked much better on sources that I transcribed into Word and shared the document through Elevate than where I shared a PDF or an image. What was particularly good was I found the students made much better use of sources in their extended essay at the end of the module, and they made much better use of these sources this year than they have done in previous years. And I think that was almost exclusively due to the use of Elevate, which I was really pleased with. A problem that I had, though, was I had two different seminar groups, and I flagged this. I think at one point Elevate, Talis asked me to be in a sort of feedback group. I had two different seminar groups, and what I found I had to do was to give each group a separate collection of the documents, because I didn't want the second group to go in and see all the comments from the first document. The idea was the students wouldn't have read through these documents before class. They'd see them fresh and they'd read through them, and then we'd get their sort of gut reactions. So I didn't want them to see comments that a group before had made, and I wish there'd been a way to sort of merge the comments together. I think that would be very difficult technically to do, but that was one of the issues I had. So I was quite pleased with it. Can we go on to the next slide? Just to remind, this was just a trial, and I hadn't thought about it as much as I would have liked to have done. But what really blew me away, and can we go on to the next slide, was that the student reaction to this was overwhelmingly positive. As I said at the start, I've been involved in things for about 30 years. I trialed our use of the virtual learning environment 20 years ago. I also trialed the use of Turnitin about 10 years ago. All of these things, I've had mixed reactions from students, but the students found it were overwhelmingly positive about the use of this. And I was really surprised at the extent to which I don't think there were any really sort of hugely negative comments in the end. They really liked the way that they were able to look across a range of sources, get into the sources and see for things that they hadn't read in class, so something that another group might have looked at. They could go into that for their essay and see what other students had highlighted, what were the significant points that they needed. They also said that it gave them a lot of confidence in using materials, that sometimes some of these sources are very strange, they're very different from sort of traditional things. We were using some sort of oral history, we were using some Native American folklore, very different from the sorts of things they often use. And they felt that seeing other people's comments gave them confidence to use these things. And they felt much more confident about utilizing sources in their essay than they would have done otherwise. And I was quite impressed by that. They did want more guidance, and I didn't give them much guidance because, as I said, it was just a trial and I was just trying to see how they would react to it. But there were no problems, I think, in terms of students not understanding how to use the system. It seems to be very straightforward to use, and the student, no complaints about the students using. Can we go to the next slide? So this is some of my student feedback. So I just used Mentimeter. Our formal feedback process is very fixed, so you can't ask very specific questions. They found it was seeing other people's comments in particular that they found really useful. I think it's a reasonable way for students to be able to access sources, but I don't think it necessarily gives you a lot of advantage over just a document. I should probably have highlighted to them more how they can use it to make their own personal notes, so they could flag things in a document that they can go back to when they're working on an essay or presentation. As I said, this was a trial, so I didn't really flag this. Can we go on to the next slide? These are some specific comments I got back from the students. And so just to sort of see the things here about how the students thought, and there are a lot more comments than this, but we decided it was better to share the PowerPoint than try to share the screen. You can see, I liked being able to make comments for myself if I was unsure, but seeing other people's comments gave me more confidence. It helped promote discussion. I found it really useful. It was good to go through the sources, all of the overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I don't think I ever fully understood what it was. That was the fact that I didn't really explain it right at the start to students. But I think if I explained it, it would work even better. And then the next slide about how they would like me to use it better, more explanation at the start. And I go back to see, and also some complaint that I was using sources that were too long. And I think that would be something that I would think about next year. I mean, these were quite hefty sources. In some cases, they were 10 or 11 pages long, even longer than that on occasion. And I certainly for the module that I'm teaching next year, I'm thinking about having perhaps 3-page extracts and getting the students to focus in on them much more. And can we go on to the next slide? So my future plans, I think my university is still sort of trying to work out whether it's going to get the license or not. And my understanding is we are going to get it. But if we get the license, I definitely want to use it again. I can see huge potential here across humanities, particularly history, English, philosophy, anything where you're using a text as a source. What would I do differently? I'd give the students much more guidance on how to use it. I think at the start of the module, I would do a pre-recording showing the students how to use it and also explaining to them this is how you should highlight a source, because they're not used to highlighting sources. They're used to reading them, but not annotating them. So I think I would flag to them, what I want you to do is outline the points that are significant, explain how, when, where, why this point is significant, where there's a name or a date or a proper noun, think about actually finding out what that is and analyze it. And I would tie it, one of the things the students said they would like is that it should be tied to some form of assessment. I think it would be quite easy to design an assessment that was just linked to TALIS. And I don't think this would be problematic. What I'm thinking of doing next semester, because I can't change the assessment for the module now, is tying it, my students do an online blog for this module, and of tying it into that. So we actually, fortunately for this class, we spend an hour each week in an IT suite. And this is actually when I'm thinking about getting the students to use Elevate and share their annotations with each other. I think it could also be useful where students are working on journal articles. Within my institution, we've discussed a bit whether copyright for a journal article might be an issue. I don't think it would be, but I'd want to get that cleared before I'd finished. The only issue I possibly have is how accessible the annotations are. So can we go into the sort of next slide? This is the accessibility that Aspire in a statement that Elevate and Aspire have. I had no problems with accessibility. None of the students complained, except some of the newspapers actually were very difficult to read. But this might be the one thing that I'm slightly concerned about whether all how accessible the annotations are and how easy it is to make them accessible to students using voice readers and things. And I'd like more information on how to do that. So can we go on to the final slide? So that's me essentially done. I hope this wasn't sort of false advertising in the sense that this was a trial. But my main thing was just how positive my students were about using it, how useful it was in terms of giving. These are students who are coming to the end of their history degree. They should be very confident in using source materials, but the Scottish degree is quite a broad degree. They do a range of different subjects. We have a lot of joint honours students. And I think it was those sorts of students who found this very reassuring. And I was also pleased a lot of students in this class then switched to do a dissertation with me using some of these materials, and I had some great dissertations. I mean, they were using much bigger corpuses of material, but I think this gave them a really firm introduction into the materials they were going to use and gave them confidence. And I think that's something that's very difficult to sort of get out. It was the confidence that they saw from using these materials alongside other people and saying, hey, yes, this person has seen the same issues that I'm working with, and I think this works really well. But they do need clear guidance, and I didn't give them that this year. So, but as I said, it was a trial. So that's my piece is done. So any questions I'm happy to answer, but as I keep saying, it was a trial. So